Hey everybody, it's Friday evening and we are going to take a very impromptu trip around the world. This is my 29-gallon Miscellaneous and we always start here, so that's why I started here, but this is not where we're really going to actually start the video proper. We are going to turn around for a moment and we're going to start the video here on my Waterfall tank so we can get this done and over with, and then I can turn all these lights out and reduce the glare on the rest of the room. Not a lot to talk about here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about water changes and all that kind of stuff. I did take the filter apart recently, and by cleaning it out thoroughly on the inside, I seem to have restored the flow of water somewhat. It was getting a little on the low side, but after cleaning it out the way I have, I've got a pretty significant amount of water flowing through here again. The chief thing I've done recently is add some more plants. Namely, plants that are not in the waterfall. This is columbine, and then this is just some stone crop that's going to be like a ground cover. I'm hoping it'll sort of grow out and over and give us a sort of cascading effect. This is bleeding heart. I shot a video yesterday where I showed you after I'd installed it. It was literally minutes, maybe half an hour after I installed it, and you could see the tops here and everything was still very droopy and wilted from being dug up and transplanted, but it is already stood up and we are already getting flowers that you can see are fully open. So it's hard to actually get a good look at anything under this LED. It is so bright it just washes the camera out. I've said before, these that come out looking almost white are actually a very pretty shade of pink, and you just can't tell because that light is so bright. But that's all that's really going on here. I did take some of my dead nettles and sort of trail them across, so hopefully we'll get, some more of this kind of stuff going on, and it'll sort of cover up all that, green rubbery look that used to have stuff growing over it back in the day. Oh, and I also put a chunk of daylilies back there. All these sort of green spiky things you can see is daylilies, and then I piled some rocks up around the mass of mud and rhizome and laid this stick from down here. It's now up over top of those daylilies, so pretty soon we should start to see that growing and coming out. It's going to wind up growing out towards the light, and we'll get a really 3D effect coming out of the tank. At least that's what we got from it last summer. I also got my Rex begonia here turned around, and we get to see the underside of the leaves, but those leaves are gradually going to flip over this way, and we will be looking at the top side of them, which again is pretty in its own right, but the underneath of these is just such a really awesome shade of almost crimson red. It's really pretty. I like it a lot. So that's about all that's going on here. No new fish, nothing really going on to talk about. Nothing's died, nothing's come out. I need to do a filter change, but that's about every 3 days on this tank. I could probably do a top off, and right now of course we don't have the light turned on that's shining down into the tank. That light's not turned on. No need for it really. Like I said, we're not really going to be looking at the fish per se. Likewise with this tank, nothing really going on. I do need to get in there. I have removed the pre-filter from my little pump down here, so it's just an open pump, and for as low as that water is flowing, that means it's got snails packed all over it. So I really need to get in there and clean those snails out and use some of those sponge filters I bought. I want to cut one up and make a custom fitted little pre-filter to go on that pump. So that's a project to work on one of these days. I do have another idea about what I might want to do with this tank, but I'm not sure about it yet. I've been tossing around the idea of shooting a video to kind of throw the idea out there, so look forward to a video about this tank possibly coming up in the near future. So that's about all I can think of with these. We will call that good and get these really bright lights turned off. And that will allow us to actually see into these tanks a little better without too much glare. Now, as I said, this is a super duper impromptu video. It's been kind of a hectic week, and I just grabbed my camera and popped in here, so we're going to look through the tanks together, and I have no idea what we might find once we get into some of them. So my 29 Miscellaneous here, really needs a water change. If nothing else, I at least need to top it off. You can see how ridiculously low that water level is. I don't honestly remember whether I've topped it off since my last water change or not. Either way, it's no big deal. I have such a low amount of dissolved solids in my water. Even if I top a tank off 3 or 4 times between water changes. First of all, I have the option of using RO water if I want. But I usually use my groundwater, which has maybe 200 parts per million dissolved solids in it, and that's total. So, again, it doesn't really, build up the dissolved solids in my water if I top it off a few times. But other than that, nothing really going on in this tank. You can see it's been kind of sitting since my last water change. I need to wipe the glass down and probably get in there and do a little bit of a gravel vac. My Bolivian ram did die, but that's been a while ago, and it's probably been covered in my last video. But again, it's been a hectic week, and I'm not sure if I've mentioned that, but I no longer have the Bolivian ram in this tank. So moving on to my 55-gallon Gourami tank. Scratching my arm here for a minute. Sorry for the camera jiggle. Nothing really going on in this tank either. As I said, it's been kind of a hectic week. I haven't been doing a whole lot in the fish room, and the little bit I have been doing has involved fish dying, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, 55-gallon Gourami tank. I did remove the angelfish from this tank. I moved it over to my 125, which we'll see once we get around to the other side of the room, or perhaps I should say the other side of the world. And that's it. I took the angelfish out of there. I did a water change. I wiped the glass down, and that's about it. I didn't do any kind of chemi-clean treatment. I didn't get in there and mess around with the filter or anything like that. I was going to mention that you can see how rough the plants look in this tank, and you can see that Chinese algae eater. I'm sorry, that Siamese algae eater. I mistakenly called it Chinese. That is a Siamese algae eater. You can see I got another one right there. And for as much as people like to say, oh, they do a good job when they're young, but as they get bigger, they don't eat very much algae, or they don't eat algae as much. Well, yeah, that's not been my experience. They may not eat as much as they did when they were young. They might like to have some more meatier foods as they get older, but that doesn't mean they stop eating algae by any stretch of the imagination. They don't stop eating plants. I do have the gouramis in this tank, which work on these plants, and that's why the plants look so rough. Notwithstanding all of the stuff that's growing on them, but as far as the way they look so tattered and ripped up, that's because that's the gouramis. You can see one little one back there is eyeing up some lunch. Going to be nibbling on them leaves in a minute. And that's why the plants look like this in this tank. Between the gouramis and those Siamese algae eaters, they make short work of them. So I don't care. It doesn't bother me at all. I'm happy the fish are in there with a nice natural food source and chewing on them. So you can see that Siamese algae eater over there nibbling away. That's all they do all day long is work over those plants. So again, I always recommend those Siamese algae eaters. They are worth their weight in gold when it comes to helping keep your tank clean. Of course, they can also be a little on the nibbly side when it comes to munching on your plants. Although, honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if the Siamese algae eaters are actually responsible for the nibbled leaves at all. They might just be chewing the algae off of the leaves. If I were to take the gouramis out of this tank, I probably wouldn't have that experience. Because, as we move on to my 55-gallon tank, I've got 2 of the same fish in this tank, and I don't get any of that same kind of destruction on the leaves. Now, I'll grant you this tank has Anubias, which is probably like chewing on linoleum, so I don't think the Siamese algae eaters would be chewing on that. But I do have another tank with 4 Siamese algae eaters in it that are younger, so therefore would be more prone to eating plants and stuff. And as you'll see when we get to that tank, we shouldn't be having any issues either. I was hoping we were going to get to see a little bit of that. My diamond tetras are showing spawning behavior again. They do this fairly regularly. They put on quite a display when they're doing it. And I'm hoping before long I'll see some of them pairing off. And, well, I got these 2 down here that are sort of disappearing into the bushes for a few minutes. And then they come back out. And that's how I'm going to get little baby diamond tetras. I already have 4 of them upstairs in my office tank that I got out of here. I'm not putting in mops or doing anything special. For those of you who are about to ask me a question about that or whatever, I'm not too concerned about it. I've never really specifically tried to breed any type of fish. If they do, they do. That's awesome. You know, if the eggs get eaten or whatever, that's just, you know, whatever happens, happens. If I find some fry in there, that'll be fantastic. But I'm not going to do anything specifically other than provide the proper habitat. In the wild, the majority of those eggs would get eaten as well, and some of them would survive because they would be nicely hidden away in the dense vegetation, and that's exactly what happens in this tank. Most of them do get eaten, but obviously 4 of them at one point did survive to be big enough that I was able to collect them out of the tank and move them, and now we've got 4 of these awesome diamond tetras in my office tank. So again, I always recommend these diamond tetras. If you come across them or you happen to see them and you've never seen them before, buy them while you've got the opportunity, because if you wait and you go back and they're gone, you're going to kick yourself later. They're really an awesome fish. I really highly recommend them. Other than gushing on about my diamond tetras, as I so often do, nothing really to speak about in this tank either. Again, not really been doing a whole lot in the fish room this week. So, moving on to my 40 breeder here. You can see there's 2 of my Siamese algae eaters right there. It's my Dwarf Pike cichlid. And if you look around the tank, you can see that I do indeed have growth and crud and all kind of stuff all over the leaves and everything in there. But I don't have plants that have been chewed to pieces. So I don't think it's the Siamese algae eaters that are actually chewing up the plants in my Gourami tank. I think that's just straight up strictly my Gouramis doing that. So this tank did actually get a pretty significant water change this week. I got in there with my gravel vac, and for as limited access as I have even to the bottom, let alone the gravel itself, I really did vac out a lot of stuff that had collected on the bottom, mulm, that had broken down and was just almost like a thick mat of crud on the bottom. It was actually coming up almost in, like, I don't quite want to say chunks, but clumps maybe. Might be more appropriate. It was definitely a lot of stuff on the bottom of that tank that needed to get out of there. So I got most of that out of there. I did not do a filter change, but I found that my nitrate levels in this tank were surprisingly low. I don't have a lot of really fast-growing plants in this tank, and that's what eats up the nitrates. Everybody knows that a planted tank can give you reduced levels of nitrates, but you've got to have a tank that's either injected or you've got pothos plant growing in it. You've got to have some really vigorous growth going on to suck up all those nitrates. And in this case, I mean, you can see right here, maybe I got 1 or 2 little anubias leaves. I got a couple of little, you know, fresh green shoots coming up down there, and that's it. I don't have any kind of vigorous growth activity in this tank at all, and yet my nitrates were really low. So I'd love to know what, like, the bacterial loads and stuff like that are getting up to be in this tank with all that mulm and crud and everything in there breaking down the way it was. I don't think it's an unhealthy environment for the fish necessarily. Don't think it's necessarily, you know, the ideal environment for the fish, but I don't think the fish were in any, you know, risk of being, you know, in any kind of bad tank or anything. But, you know, at the same time, it was an awful lot of crud in there. I really do need to get in this tank and do some kind of remodeling or rescaping or something. I know I've been talking about that forever, but this tank really is kind of sentimental for me, and it's going to break my heart to get in there and pull stuff out and rearrange it. I guess I could just open it up a little. I don't have to change it necessarily. I can just get in there and gently remove some of the plants and let it keep going. But anyway, again, not a lot going on necessarily, just kind of thinking out loud as we go around the room and look at the tanks. That's about all this video is going to amount to. So my New World tank, don't know when the last time I did an Around the World update was, so for those of you who only watch my Around the World updates, I did get in here a while ago and did some rescaping. Look at one of my little nearite snails right there hanging out. I have 3 of them in this tank, and they are worth their weight in gold too as far as keeping everything clean, because they eat that green spot algae and nothing else does. And if you see sort of the dark coloration on the leaves that's in the depressions, that's the green spot algae that's left behind from where the snails can't scrape, down in every single little nook and cranny. And that dark green algae gets left behind. So all of that clean area is where the snails have scraped. So if it wasn't for them, those Anubias used to be completely covered with that really dark green spot algae. You couldn't even wipe it off with your thumb. So again, those nerite snails are absolutely worth their weight in gold when it comes to cleaning up that green spot algae. The big piece of wood here used to be weighted down by this really, really big rock right there, and a few other rocks used to be in this tank. And I was able to take that rock out. I was able to take the entire piece of wood and bring it down this way, which lowered this end of it a little bit. I was able to draw this end down almost to the corner of the tank there. And so now it is literally wedged in there. I can't actually get it to go any further into the tank than it is. But by doing that, it's actually still trying to float. And by trying to float a little bit, I was able to scoop some of the sand or gravel out from underneath of it. And so now even the larger fish in the tank, even my spotted tilapia, is able to swim right underneath of that. He has to turn on the side a little bit, or she does, I should say. But can go right underneath of that and swim around. So I got a lot more visual activity in the tank with that. I just noticed my medium-size shiner here is actually not looking very good. Can't really put my finger on what doesn't look good about it. Its tail's a little tattered and it looks a little skinny. So I'm not sure what might be going on with that. It certainly eats well enough. It always seems like I got something going on somewhere with one fish, at least one fish at any given moment in one tank somewhere or another. The other thing I wanted to mention that I've noticed recently is my silver dollars are getting really big. I have the spotted silver dollars, which I believe are going to stay a little bit smaller. And then I have the regular, just silver dollars. And they're growing fast. I got these at much, much smaller size than I got these. And you can see it's already starting to surpass the spotted silver dollars. So it's going to be interesting to see how big they ultimately get. My angelfish is doing well and looking fantastic. I think that fish goes so perfectly in this tank. I'm really, really happy that I moved that over here. But again, that's been a while ago since that happened. So other than that, not much to talk about. I'm assuming I've covered the fact that I removed a lot of fish from this tank. I took some of those big chubs out of there. I did miss 2 of the chubs. I've still got to get in here and get that one out. And that one right there. Those 2 are both creek chubs. And then all these smaller fish, they can stay in there. They're full grown. They're not going to get any bigger than that. I don't know exactly what they are. They're some type of Neotropis species. I do not believe they are black-nosed dace. A lot of people seem to think they are. I once thought they were, but I looked, and I really don't think they're black-nosed dace. But when you get into looking at those different Neotropis species, there's so many of them that look so close together. You literally have to count the scales or count the number of rays in their fins to differentiate between them. And that's why I stopped a long time ago trying to figure out exactly what species they are. They're some type of Neotropis species. There's some little minnows I catch in the local streams around here. So whatever. Again, it's academic. I don't have to know what they're called specifically. So moving on from there. Turn this fan off. My snail tank has some crushed up eggshells in it. I had a cuttlebone in there, but the cuttlebone dissolved away completely. I need to do this, of course, because my water is so soft. I need to put some calcium in there so that the snails, as they grow, will develop a hard enough shell that it's worth feeding to my puffer, because the whole point is the snail shells help the puffer's teeth get ground down. They're like rodents' teeth. They don't wear down, or they keep growing, and if you don't wear them down, they'll grow too long, and the puffer wouldn't be able to eat anymore. So they have to eat hard-shelled type food. And I've even seen my puffer pick up gravel off the bottom and swim around crunching on gravel and then spitting it back out. So I don't know if it's doing that deliberately to grind its teeth down, or it's really bored, or what, but I've seen it do that. Anyway, that's all that's going on in my snail tank. I threw some eggshells in there. My purple spotted gudgeon tank, I found a very curious thing the other day. I did a water change on it, and I checked the nitrates, expecting in this tank, because it's so heavily planted, and I've got these really fast-growing temple plant. I took about a half pound of duckweed off the surface, which just soaks up the nitrates. The duckweed is a really, really fast-growing plant. And the Ludwigia is in here. I mean, you can see my Ludwigia is even starting to come emergent up and out of the water at this point. I got floating water sprite in there. That's actually starting to grow, up and out, and we're starting to get some emergent growth from the water sprite. So this tank has mad crazy growth in it, and yet I had pretty high nitrates in this tank, so that was a bit of a puzzler. I posted a video talking in more detail about that, but other than that, there really isn't anything going on in this tank as well. For the people that make comments about the lack of circulation in this tank, I understand that this side of the tank appears to be stagnant because the surface doesn't really move around very much, but I've got quite a flow of water. If you actually look in here, I mean, you can see the leaves and everything when the plant's moving around. I'll grant you, by the time you get down to this corner, it's not as much water flow. But when I drop food in the tank, I can watch it do that as it's going to the bottom. There's plenty of water moving this way. And then in the back of the tank, I have a 400 gallon per hour power head blowing down and across the back to keep the water moving that way. In fact, if you look back there, you'll see there's no sand in one spot because that's where that power head is blowing. So all this stagnant looking water is just literally straight up on the surface. Once you get down into the tank, the water is swirling around a little more, and regardless, that wouldn't affect my nitrates anyway for whatever reason. I don't know why people seem to think stagnant water would affect my nitrates, but it doesn't. I'm trying to, you can almost make out the gudgeon hiding back there in the corner. There he is. So now he's going to drift down closer to the bottom. Not the most exciting fish in the world. Very cool fish, very interesting fish in its own right, and a very attractive fish, but definitely not an exciting fish, except at feeding time. Then it can be a whole lot of excitement very, very quickly. So there you go. There's my purple spotted gudgeon tank, although it looks more like an aquatic garden than a fish tank. But moving on, we will sort of pan our way along my 125 till we can get over here and have a look at the whole tank and all of the crap I've got piled on top of it. Apparently most of that is actually medicated fish food, but we can talk about that in a minute. So that's a look at the overall tank. Once again, I already need to get back in there and wipe the glass down because I've got the algae growing on the glass. I've got a fine sheen of the hair algae, the green hair algae growing on most things in the tank, but it's not too bad. It just sort of gives a green tint to everything. It almost makes it look like I've got green water, although I do not. The water in there is not green. It's just green is growing on everything, and it just gives that appearance. So my angelfish is doing well. The only thing, this is the angelfish I mentioned earlier that was over in my Gourami tank for many years, and eventually I brought it over into this tank, and you can see color-wise how it just goes into this tank and matches up thematically so well. It might not be, from the same continent as those other fish or whatever. I've got mishmash from all over the place: Indonesia, Africa, Australia, and South America. So, whatever. I'm not too worried about any kind of biotope in this tank. That fish looks absolutely fantastic in this tank, and I'm really, really happy with it. The thing I've got going on, the reason you see so many different medications on top of the tank, is because I've got this loach here that seems to be very skinny. I've got this loach here, which does not. And then I've got one more loach somewhere else that does seem to be awfully skinny, and I don't know where it is at the moment, but they definitely do look skinny. There's no arguing about that. You can see my Tenopoma's hiding down there between the leaves where it normally does. So no argument that my loaches look skinny. 2 of the 3 of them do anyway. The one looks fine. But I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if they've got some kind of gut parasite. I don't know if they're just not eating well, if I haven't been feeding the tanks properly. So I have been feeding them a mixture of different medicated foods. This is an actual medicated food. And then this stuff is actually medicated flakes that the fish really don't like to eat. And I took them and I mushed them all together with some algae wafers and some shrimp pellets and got them all into a paste. I let that paste dry out, and now I've got these algae wafer slash shrimp pellet slash medicated flake crumbles that I can throw in the tank, and I'm hoping it will get eaten. It does not seem that the loaches are really going after it all that much, but I come back later and it's gone. So somebody's eating it. I know for a fact that the rainbow fish eat it, and I know that the angelfish eats some of it at least. So I don't know how much of it they're eating, but I'm hoping the loaches are eating some of it at least, and we can get them straightened out, because I've had them for years now and I would really hate to lose them. Speaking of losing them, I did also lose my Australian rainbow fish that was in this tank this morning. I'll attach a card to that video. It was kind of a gruesome video, I'll forewarn you. It was dead, and it had something hanging out of it that I could not identify. It looked vaguely like frog eggs. It was sort of like jelly with dark spots in it almost. And a viewer of mine sent me a picture of some rainbow fish eggs, and I also Google searched rainbow fish eggs, and that's absolutely what it was. There were several pictures that looked really similar, and again, this was just rainbow fish in general, so I don't know which species I was looking at, but a lot of them looked very similar to what I was seeing, and then several of them were absolutely spot on what I was looking at hanging out of my fish. So definitely not what I would have thought fish eggs looked like. Again, more like frog eggs to me. But it seems to have been egg bound. I don't know if egg bound is something fish can get. I know other animals can get egg bound, and that can cause complications that winds up killing them. But that's what I think happened to that rainbow fish. I think it was egg bound, or again, whatever the fish equivalent of that is. And that's why it died. But whatever caused its death, what was hanging out of it was definitely eggs from a rainbow fish. So definitely a female, definitely had eggs hanging out of it, and it's definitely dead. So there you go with that. Moving on, my 20-gallon angelfish tank here. Nothing at all to talk about in this one. You can see my glass needs to be wiped down. That's the price you pay when you really, really super brightly light your tanks the way I do. I don't mess around when I light my tanks up. I like my plants to grow vigorously. I like to be able to see the fish. I like a good full spectrum light so I get lots of color and sparkle and everything. And the downside of that is you get mad, crazy algal growth, and you can get cyanobacteria and all sorts of other stuff you don't necessarily want growing in there. But again, whatever. It's just part of my regular maintenance. But you can see this week, as I keep saying, it's been a little bit hectic. And as a result, most of my tanks at least need a good water change and wiping of the glass. So not a lot to talk about in this tank, so we will move on to my quarantine tank. That looks an awful lot different. I've got a couple of eggshells thrown in there. I've got some algae wafers and some fish food and one big snail. Other than that, I completely cleaned it out. I did shoot a video about this, and a few people talked about the tank as how dirty it was and all that, as though it was like a tank I had fish in or something. So first of all, remember, it was a tank that was sitting here empty. I just never got around to cleaning it up, and maybe it might have occurred to some people that I was also deliberately letting it get as nasty as it did because I wanted to shoot a video talking about just that very thing, which is what I did. So now the tank's nice and clean, and there you go. That's my quarantine tank, although who knows when I'll be out and about buying more fish, but whatever, we'll see what happens as time goes on. So my brackish tank here, turn that forward light on. I'm going to say it again, not a lot to talk about in here. I've been trying to keep my puffer a little more occupied as I've been spending more time around the house. I've noticed that he seems to be bored on occasion. He really spends a lot of time watching me when I'm down in the basement. And so I've been trying to spread his snails around a little more. Instead of just dumping them in the middle in one big clump, I've been trying to put them in there and scatter them around, so it gives him a little more of what you would call enrichment, I guess, a little natural foraging behavior. And I don't know if it's helping or not as far as his, mental state. As far as his physical state goes, he still has those lesions all over him, and while they look different than they did before, they're still there. They used to be more sort of like, almost look like gouged lines in him, and now they just sort of look like spots or specks or something. So I don't know exactly what that is. I don't know if that's something on him or if it's lesions in the skin. I've always assumed it was lesions of some sort. I always assumed that it was like not necessarily open sores, but maybe necrotic skin, maybe sort of calloused tissue or something like that. But now I'm almost beginning to think it looks like some sort of growth on the surface of the skin. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. I will say that I shot a video not too long ago with Butterbean here swimming around with a a goby in its mouth. And it looked like it was stuck in his mouth. And when I came back later, I threw a snail in there to maybe figure if he tried to eat the snail, it would knock the dead body of the goby loose. And he spit it out, came over, ate the snail, then went back over and picked up the goby and started swimming around with it again. And throughout the rest of the afternoon, every time I came in here, he was still swimming around with that goby hanging out of his mouth. And every time it was a little bit smaller, but he still carried it around. And on 3 or 4 different occasions, I threw a couple snails in there, and he did the same thing. He put the body of the goby down, and then he went over and he ate the snails. And when he was done, investigating around to make sure he'd gotten all the snails and he hadn't missed any, he went back over and he picked up his little dead goby and started swimming around with it again. It reminded me of a dog with his chew toy or something. It was really sort of strange. But for everybody that was worried that it was stuck, and he couldn't get it off of his mouth or whatever, that wasn't the case at all. He was just carrying it around like that was his little chew toy. So there you go. That's about all I've got to say on that. And we now end up back here where we started at my 29 Miscellaneous. So thanks for joining me on that very impromptu trip around the world. A little bit slapdash, not a lot to talk about, but I still managed to drag it out to over half an hour. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget, this one is my 29 Miscellaneous, and I will see you real soon in the next one.